Africa's growing population will soon put pressure on the continent's energy supply. And that's the warning from One Campaign in its report about finding solutions to climate change. Africa's population is predicted to increase to nearly 2.5 billion people by 2050 from the current 1.4 billion. This will put further strain on the continent's electricity and food supplies. Olawunmi Ola-Busari from the One Campaign joins me now for more on this conversation. So Olawunmi, thank you for joining me. Let's start the conversation by just an overall perspective from your report. It's wide-ranging. It covers a number of issues that have to do with the nexus between population growth, but also demands on resources such as energy and food. And I believe in your report, the word existential crisis, the phrase existential crisis comes up. What's that all about?
Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. Yes, it is. Climate change is an existential threat to human life and our natural system. We are only meant to thrive in a particular range of temperatures, and our global warming is currently exceeding, those optimal temperatures. So it is existential. It's existential because it poses a risk to all of the resources, water, land that we need to live good lives.
And you then go on to talk about the various resources in terms of how they'll be strained by growing populations. Let's take the energy situation, for example. You link that to the whole issue around climate change and make the point that Africa contributed the least to the situation we find ourselves in, but is the continent that is most vulnerable in as far as climate events and climate change is concerned. What are the trends that you are seeing in as far as the continent's vulnerability to adverse events linked to climate change?
So Africa is home to the 10 most climate vulnerable countries in the world, accounting for about 150 million people. And yet, G20 countries and rich industrialized countries are actually the largest contributors to historical carbon emissions. Africa is particularly susceptible to climate change because of its weak adaptive capacity. So a lot of countries don't have the money that they need to respond to the floods like we're seeing in Nigeria, for example. We also have a high dependency on ecosystems, on nature for our livelihoods, and a high dependency on rain-fed agriculture. And all of these things make African countries particularly susceptible to changes in long-term weather patterns.
And then there's this whole issue of, in South Africa, we call it a just transition from a high carbon energy environment to a low carbon energy environment. But all of this is happening in a context where actually we are in a current and pressing energy situation. When you look at the situation that South Africa finds itself in, needing to transition to a low carbon energy situation from a high carbon situation in the midst of an energy crisis, does it sum up the issues that you raise in terms of what the continent faces, including on issues of, financing of this transition?
Yes, energy is such an important thing for development, and African countries have very large ambitions for what they want to do. However, the world is moving towards net zero. Renewable energy is our long-term vision, is our long-term future. And in order to not get left behind, in order to not be left with stranded assets of fossil fuel infrastructure, African countries need to start investing in this transition now. However, they need finance to be able to do that. We need finance to be able to upgrade our energy infrastructure, our transmission and distribution lines. We need finance to be able to tap into the great potential that African countries have to harness solar and wind energy. Africa has 60% of the world's best solar resources, but just over 1% of installed capacity. And that is as a result of a lack of investment. And so we really need wealthy countries that have benefited from being able to use fossil fuels, most of them extracted from African countries, to enrich themselves. We need them to help developing countries finance this transition. So initiatives like the Just Energy Transition Partnership that South Africa has are increasingly important. We need finance for energy transition. We need climate finance for adaptation. We need climate finance for mitigation. We just need more finance. And we need for high-income industrialized countries to step up, because right now they have not even yet met their promise of mobilizing $100 billion a year for climate finance for low-income countries.
Yeah, and at the same time, though, Olawunmi, it would seem to me from what you said about, for instance, the capacity for solar energy versus the installed capacity of solar energy that we have, that in this crisis, there are also opportunities. So what are the opportunities that the continent, perhaps to use modern day parlance, that we are quote unquote sleeping on, in that we're not really exploiting, that are readily or could readily be within reach?
Much of what we're not exploiting is our natural resources, our renewable resources. So we hear so much about how Africa has, huge natural gas reserves or huge oil reserves, but we have yet to see how those reserves have really translated into better quality of life for people. And so what we need to do is we need African countries to establish national and regional strategies and develop credible pipelines of projects towards tapping into the renewable energy resources that we do have, and also into the critical minerals that we have that are going to be really important for a green energy future. So, South Africa, for example, South Africa and Zimbabwe have 75% or more of the world's platinum, which is going to be critical in the use of green hydrogen production. And then you have DRC that has 2/3 of the world's global cobalt production. And cobalt is used in electric vehicles, in lithium-ion batteries, and can be used in carbon capture installations. So we're talking about industries of the future, and we're going to see demand for these critical minerals increase over the next decade. And what we need to do as Africans is we need to position ourselves to be able to take advantage of these things, not only in terms of supplying these raw materials, but actually adding value on our continent. And that's where things like the free trade continental agreement become important, because we all have different comparative advantages. We need to be able to refine and export these minerals not as raw materials, but as inputs into renewable energy infrastructure. So we need investment for that, and we need plans for that.
Yeah, and this is why conversations such as the one that's long been had on the African continent around issues such as the Great eNCA Dam project, for example, if only we would take it from beyond the drawing rooms and the boardrooms and actually get moving with projects like those. Finally, Olawunmi, there are many facets to this report of yours that I could describe as startling, but I'd like you to just highlight one. For starters, you talk about the frequency of droughts in sub-Saharan Africa, and you say it has tripled in the decade 2010 to 2019, if you compare it with 1970 to 1979, but also among the other climate change related adverse events. You talk about the possibility of the Sahel, if certain trends materialize, potentially becoming inhospitable for human beings. That is scary.
Yes, it is scary, and it's not a hypothetical. It is something that's happening right now. As the Sahara Desert is increasingly expanding, which it has over the past few decades, we are finding that people have to move. So when you think about pastoralists and nomads, They have to move in order to be able to find arable land, in order to be able to access water. And as that becomes more challenging, we're only going to see more internal migration within sub-Saharan Africa. Estimates put it as high as 86 million people becoming internal climate migrants by 2050. And as you have these populations migrating into other people's spaces, you're going to also have a heightened risk of conflict, because we're going to be competing, people are going to be competing for scarcer resources. And we're already seeing some of that. Climate change is a threat multiplier. It increases the potential of poverty. It increases the potential of conflict. And already in the Sahel, we're seeing some of this. So these risks, we often talk about climate risks as distant things, but actually they're here and they're now for millions of people, which is why we need money for adaptation and why we need money for compensating communities that now have to rebuild after extreme disasters.
All right, thank you for your insights, Olawunmi. As I say, the report is wide-ranging and it is available online for folks to actually engage with. It's fascinating. It presents quite a number of insights that you can engage with. From the one campaign that is Olawunmi Ola-Busari there, you can look up the report and just, grapple with the realities that we face around issues of population growth on the one hand and demands on various resources, food, energy, etc.